I'm Sue Stockdale, and welcome to the Access to Inspiration podcast, which provides you with inspiration through conversation. You won't find celebrities in this podcast, but you will find amazing people, including a sports scientist, a neuroscientist, and an environmentalist. Each of their amazing stories has the power to strengthen, shape, and challenge your views of the world. I hope the conversation ignites new possibilities within you, makes you think and behave differently as a result. Our final guest for this series about curiosity is Mick Dawson. He's a former Royal Marine, a professional sailor, author, motivational speaker, and one of the most experienced and successful ocean rowers in the world. He's undertaken a total of 6 ocean rows in the last 2 decades, 2 across the Atlantic Ocean, 4 across the Pacific, rowing over 22,000 nautical miles. Most notably, he became the first person to successfully row across the North Pacific from Japan to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco during an epic voyage with his friend and rowing partner Chris Martin. It took them 189 days and 10 hours and 55 minutes to complete their non-stop record-breaking voyage. I can't wait to find out more about that and all of his experience and insights and how curiosity has played a role in his success. Welcome to the podcast, Mick.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Great to speak to you.
I'm delighted that you're our final guest for this series, which is on curiosity. And I'm pretty certain that curiosity has played a role in these amazing adventures that you've had. Just to remind our listeners that you've done over 22,000 nautical miles on oceans. What do you think is important about curiosity and how has it played a role for you?
I think for me, it started as a young child and I saw things that piqued my curiosity, principally things to do with the sea, and I saw it as a source of adventure and excitement. And I followed that curiosity and that led me down towards the sea and, as you say, excessive miles in an ocean rowing boat crossing it.
So it just goes to show how, when we're young, the things that can inspire us and that can cause us to do amazing adventures in later life. I'm wondering, what is it that draws you to the water, and in particular oceans, Mick?
Well, again, I absolutely agree. It's so important that you expose youngsters to as much potential as possible when they're young. And when I was growing up, albeit a long time ago now, I grew up in Boston in Lincolnshire, which on an estuary, effectively. It's a port town with a dock and a fishing fleet, or you certainly used to have a bigger fishing fleet, inshore fishing fleet. And I remember from the age of 5 walking to school, grandmother picking me and my brother up and walking us 3 or 4 miles across town to school. And we'd go across the bridge where the fishing fleet was. And to me, that fishing fleet, all the noise, the lights before it was dawn in the morning, those guys working on those boats seemed like ocean liners to me at that stage. And that river going out to some mystical place in the distance just flicked a switch in me, and a passion for the sea, for the ocean, that's never really gone away.
I guess I want to start off where your first sense of ocean rowing started, which I understand was crossing the Atlantic. How did that come about?
Well, that came 20 years ago now, well, more than that, really. 1999, I discovered there was a race to row across the Atlantic. By that stage, I'd left the Marines, was working in private yachting, which, quite frankly, I was fairly disenchanted with. I was looking for a major challenge, something to get me back on track, get me something that I had in the Royal Marines that I'd lost. Read a book called Into Thin Air about the worst season on Everest in 96, and thought, right, I'll climb Everest. And then, fortunately for me, I found out about this rowing race across the Atlantic Ocean. Thought, well, I can do that tomorrow. I don't really need to do much training for that. And that was it. I entered that race. My brother and I took part along with 36 other boats, rowed from Tenerife to Barbados. And that was another light bulb moment. The light bulb switched on. I want to do more of this.
And I understand that when you were doing that, there were some Marines that were attempting to row the Pacific at the same time. Is that right?
It was just prior. They would have been at the same time as us, but sadly they were T-boned by a fishing boat a little more than 1,000 miles from finishing that North Pacific crossing. Don, me and Tim Welford. And we'd followed their progress, particularly I'd followed it. I mean, it was fantastic. And not just out their attitude to it. It was enormous challenges to get across, and they were just dealing with it all in their stride. And when they didn't make it, and it was literally just before we set off, they were T-boned. I said, well, that's it. That's our next project. We'll pick up the baton the guys have taken there and we'll finish it for them.
Now, those are easy words to say, Mick. I'm imagining the reality is a little bit more challenging, particularly as it took you a few attempts eventually to be successful. What happened?
Well, yeah, it's a world of difference from crossing the Atlantic. I'd recommend anyone who's looking for a challenge to get involved in those races to the Caribbean from the Canaries. But the North Pacific is a totally different proposition, which I discovered and most other people who've tried discovered. And certainly in 2004, rowing solo, sadly my brother couldn't commit to it because he had two young kids. I got to almost the same spot as Tim and Dom, and I was capsized and effectively sunk. Again, thought I was on the downhill bit. So it wasn't to be.
So just let's kind of think about that for a moment or two. You're saying there you are in the midst of the Pacific Ocean on your own and your boat sinks. How do you even find a way to get help?
Well, I'd lost communications actually. My satellite phone had broken. I'm thinking about day 12 on that trip, and I'd been at sea when I capsized 109 days. Fortunately, as well as the satellite communications, I did have emergency beacons. So I had an EPIRB in the cabin with me. I was trapped in the cabin when the boat rolled over. She didn't pop up, so it was a case of having to flood that cabin to get out, which effectively sunk the boat. But fortunately, I had emergency kit with me that gave an SOS. No information, just said I had a big problem and what position I was at. And it gave me basically an opportunity to survive, really.
So there you were sending out a signal, hoping that somebody would hear that signal. And I guess as I'm listening to you, you're making it sound very rational and the sort of ordinary everyday thing that people face. How do you even contemplate and maintain belief that somebody will come to rescue you?
I think it comes with a positive attitude you've got to have to take this kind of expeditions. In my book, the first thing you've got to do when you look into any great ambition is you've got to take responsibility. And as soon as you take responsibility, even as I say that to you, I can feel myself physically and mentally preparing myself for the challenges to come. If you're not taking responsibility, you'll fold at the first real setback. And I knew that this was a real possibility. This is not a given that you're going to get across that route. Far from it. So it was my responsibility. I chose to be there. I was as well prepared in those circumstances as I could have been. Enormously grateful for my time in the Royal Marines because that really gave me a lot of the skills actually to get out of that situation, but definitely the mental attitude to stay positive and just consistently. And I said it out loud to myself, I'm not going to die here. I will get through this. Ultimately, it comes down, you take responsibility. And when things go wrong, it's your responsibility to find a way to get back on track.
And how did that happen then? Who came to rescue you?
Well, it's a combination. I'm glad to say the signal was received. I think I was in the water or in and out of the water for just under 24 hours because I expected 4 days somebody would get to me. That's what I was working on. And I'm sure if I'd have got to the end of that 4 days, I would have given myself another 4 days and just kept going until somebody turned up. But fortunately, the US Coast Guard from Kodiak, Alaska, got the signal from Falmouth, of all places. I originally received the signal because I was a Brit. Deployed the nearest resources to me, which is 600 miles due north, effectively. They flew down over my position in the black of night. Phenomenal example of their expertise. Flew around me, lit up the whole area with flares, dropped a life raft on me that I sadly let disappear into the distance because I didn't want to risk getting myself into a worse situation swimming from my one-man life raft to a 12-man one. And they then redirected a ship, the Hanjin Philadelphia, which later that night collected me. Eventually, I have to say, it got very complicated when the ship turned up. But again, yeah, I don't make light of it. I've got a huge debt to the US Coast Guard and the crew of the Hanjin Philadelphia. Without them, I certainly wouldn't be giving this podcast.
So those that came to your rescue, as you say, are a key part, I guess, of what is the camaraderie that ocean farers have. Would you agree with that you think there's something unique that those that go to sea have a mindset or an approach to helping one another?
Absolutely. And that's the perfect example of it. I'd almost go so far to say it's the romance of the sea. The people who work at sea, especially offshore at sea, all realise that they have a common, and I won't call it enemy because you could never regard the ocean as the enemy, it's an adversary. You're not meant to be there. It's a hostile environment to human beings. We choose to be there, so you have an adversary. And the biggest adversary is that common one to all of us, and that's the ocean or the sea that you set foot on. And everybody knows what the potential for things going wrong. And I loved it consistently. I remember numerous times contacting ships, usually in near-miss situations, on the VHF, the short-range radio. And almost invariably, the first thing those people would say would be, how can we help? And I like that. That sums up that ethic, that ethos between mariners that bond complete strangers together. And it bonded those people that rescued me, the Coast Guard crews that were involved, the seamen on that ship. It was that mutual bond that mariners have that sadly I think doesn't exist, certainly not to the same extent on dry land.
So there's that connectedness there. There's, as you described it, potentially the romance of the sea, and yet you are unsuccessful in that first attempt. What then motivates you to try again? Because I'm sure many people would at that stage say, well, I gave it a good shot and it wasn't to be.
I had to think long and hard about it, not least because there'd been a major national rescue mission to save me, and I had a responsibility, as far as I was concerned, from the moment I pressed that beacon, I had a responsibility for the lives of those people coming towards me. And I had to think long and hard about going back, thinking that whatever you do, however well prepared you are, there's a potential for that to happen again on that route for sure. I have to say it was a feedback from both the Coast Guard, members of the Coast Guard, and pretty much all of the crew of the Hanji in Philadelphia that convinced me. I mean, I wanted to go back, but I didn't know if it was the right thing to do, but they convinced me. In fact, the crew of the Hanji in Philadelphia running a book on how quick I would go back, and the fact that they all were certain I'd be successful the next time. So that kind of gave me permission to go back. I'm very aware that people can be critical of it, and I'm very aware that you're putting people's lives at risk if they have to come and help you. I also believe that the world's a better place for people trying to row oceans, climb mountains, fly further. You know, I grew up in the 70s, effectively 60s and 70s, and my heroes were all people who did things. That tends to have been robbed by the celebrities now, and it's more like a lifestyle that they're promoting. But the people I grew up thinking were heroes, like Shea Bly Ridgway, Robin Knox-Johnson, those people all went out and did incredible things and painted the world in bright colours for me. And to go back onto the North Pacific, knowing what I knew about it, because it's an amazing stretch of ocean where few people go, I thought that that was my opportunity to paint the world in brighter colours.
So what was different about the second attempt compared to the first?
I got to San Francisco, which is the main difference. The last attempt, I'd learned one big lesson. Again, as many good lessons I learned, by chance, I'd ended up rowing the Atlantic for a second time. I worked on the Atlantic rowing race and stepped in as a last-minute replacement for a boat I rescued the first day of the race. And I went across with a complete stranger. In difficult conditions. It was dreadful conditions, actually. 17 boats capsized in that race, although we included us, but we all popped back up. I think 6 were lost completely, although I'm pleased to say no crew were lost or badly injured. But it was a very challenging crossing on that Atlantic route. And it taught me that A, I could go with somebody other than my brother, because I'd gone with a complete stranger. And B, it taught me that 2 people rowing would be far more likely to get across the North Pacific, because it's attritional. It's stopping you pretty much all the time. And if it's not stopping you, it's definitely not helping you. So you have to have somebody able to row whenever you can possibly row, and that's simply not the case. As a solo rower, there's going to be gaps in that because you just cannot keep up that level of pace. So the big thing was that big lesson, which personally I think made it possible to be successful, because I don't think I'd have ever done it solo, was to go back with a teammate, with a crew member, and I went back with Chris Martin.
And how did you find Chris then to team up with him?
The misfortune to be in the same Atlantic rowing race, I took part in by mistake, really, or unexpectedly. And he had the double misfortune to come into Antigua. We finished in Antigua on that one, and then find himself in a pub called the Mad Mongoose with me, where I managed to persuade him eventually, after a few beers, that going to the North Pacific with me would be a good a good laugh. I think I said it was at the time, but a good idea.
So there you are. You've managed to twist Chris's arm to join you on this row. For the listener that can't imagine what rowing the Pacific is like, just paint us a picture of what the size of your boat is and what is inside it.
Well, the boat, our boat, because I obviously lost my boat when I came to grief in the Pacific going solo, I built a new boat. Bojangles was the name. She was built specifically for the North Pacific with every lesson that I'd learned incorporated. And latterly, when Chris joined, a lot of his rowing expertise. He's a way more accomplished rower than I was, a world-class flatwater rower. So technically and equipment-wise, she was as good an ocean rowing boat. Well, she was by far the best ocean rowing boat then. She's probably still as good as most now, 11 years later. But the boat's totally self-sufficient. It's got solar panels, 2 sealed compartments, forward and aft. Forward one for storage more than people. The aft one, basically our only shelter, either in between rowing shifts or when the storms come, which was frequent on the North Pacific. And in the middle is basically just a simple rowing deck with sliding seat, albeit super engineered to be tough enough to deal with what would be ultimately 6 months at sea. And everything on that boat that we thought we would need for potentially 6 months at sea, from rations to a reverse osmosis water unit to make fresh water out of salt water, and a fully incorporated musical playlist.
So you had a little luxury as well along the way.
Yeah, definitely. I had a few audiobooks. They were absolutely priceless, the audiobooks.
The conversation continues in a few seconds after this. If you are a busy person and probably always feeling behind, then you may be wondering how you can get more done in less time. One solution is working with a virtual assistant. They can help with social media, graphic design, customer service, copywriting, digital marketing, and many more tasks. iWorker is a social enterprise that connects you to talented remote workers from countries in crisis. Most of their team come from Venezuela, a country facing dire economic circumstances. By hiring from iWorker, like we do, you'll get back some time for yourself and help to change a life. Find out more by listening to episode 20, where I spoke to co-founder John Miles, or you can look at their website, iworker.co, to find out more. Now back to the podcast. And in terms of routines, I know from my own expedition experiences, creating a routine is really critical to success. Did you have any sort of rowing routine with Chris?
We were absolutely religious about our own routine. It was 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 24 hours a day. For the sailors out there, we also split the dog watch, which means we did a 1 hour watch, 6 till 8 in the evening. And then that would mean we would do different hours every day. So one day you'd actually do 13 hours. The next day you'd do 11 hours. It's amazing how fast that 11-hour day starts to feel like a day off when you're working that rigorous routine. Absolutely exhausting, but we worked out, and ultimately we were at sea over 6 months, that we may have not rowed 12 hours, 6 shifts in 6 months than when we possibly could have. When we stayed in the cabin a little longer than we needed to after a storm, or got into it a little earlier when the storm was coming. That was how religious we had to be, because we had to grab every single mile that we could towards the American coast.
And since you talk about the Pacific Ocean being against you, so to speak, what's the reason that you go from west to east and not vice versa?
That thing about it being a last great first, it was, is it possible to get across that route? Obviously, we proved it was. More specifically, we proved it was possible to get into San Francisco, not just hit North America. That could be done, but we wanted to show you could navigate through that system. To be honest, to go the other way, you'd have to come further south and come up through the Philippines to get to Japan. It would be even more difficult to travel the northern route, bizarrely, the other way around, because you'd be pushed south immediately, leaving the US coast.
So there was a practical reason for doing it that way, as much as wanting to finish under the Golden Gate Bridge.
It was a practical reason, but it was to prove it could be done. And even looking at the routing charts and all the weather systems and the potential for the wind at whatever direction we needed it, whenever, there was always that possibility. It was always going to be difficult to do it, but it was that, right, here's a chance to prove we can do something that's never been done before. And that's really, for me, more than anything, that was the principal reason to do it. We felt it could be done, but we knew it was going to be really, really difficult.
And you bring us back to that lovely theme of curiosity about what's possible.
And optimism.
I know that there must have been many, many challenges as you were rowing across the ocean, Mick. What are some of those highlights that stick in your mind, and maybe even lowlights?
On that particular trip, there were just so many things, really. The solo trip for me, even though I came to grief, probably remains in many ways the biggest high, bizarrely enough, considering how it ended, because I probably had the most contact with wildlife on that trip. Maybe that was emphasised by the virtue I was on my own, but I reckon I had about 60 or 70 close encounters on that solo trip with all manner of species of whales, sei whales, right whales, minke, pilot whales, sperm whales, on one occasion a blue whale, which remains one of the best moments in my life, or the best hour in my life. I was rowing with a blue whale for about 45 minutes, just yards away from me. I mean, it's like rowing alongside an island. On many occasions on that trip, I was adopted, some may say stalked, by a pod of killer whales. And I got to be within touching distance of killer whales in the middle of the Pacific, which has never left me. Even after I sank and it came to grief, that was one of the reasons I went back. My council estate kid from Lincolnshire, I never expected and was never meant to see anything like that in the North Pacific. gave me that opportunity. So that was a big part of going back, is to get that story again with Chris. It was a different story. We had equally great experiences, but it wasn't the same. And I think really you could go to the North Pacific 100 times and you would get 100 different stories from it.
Now, I know one that you have shared that I've heard you talk about is about the sea serpents that you experienced. Tell me about that.
Yes, I always prefix this with, there's no way I would lie about anything on these adventures, because it would just discredit something that's so important to me. And plus, you don't need to lie about it. It was incredible. So I will tell this story and your listeners take it as they will, but I swear to you, it's as I saw it. And that is, I think, the day after my birthday, June the 13th, on the solo row. I was rowing in flat calm conditions on a particularly black night with just a navigation light for illumination behind me. So it's just like a circular twilight around the boat. By this stage, quite a few fish decided to take cover under the boat for protection, wrongly in this occasion, because some large predators came and started literally decimating the fish underneath the boat. And this happens from time to time. It wasn't that unusual, but I couldn't work out what the predators were. And they were incredibly fast and incredibly aggressive. And then when one of them swam down the side of my rowing deck, where I was sat rowing at the time, it was the length of the rowing deck. So it was at least 2 meters long, and it looked like a giant conger eel. So my first thought was that. And there were about 7 or 8 of these things smashing around the boat just beneath the surface of the water. And I just couldn't believe conger eels roam the surface of the Pacific in packs. And they literally decimated the fish. Well, didn't decimate them, they totally eradicated the fish under my boat. And I hadn't identified them. And I was looking around from the rowing position when I looked over to one side, and out of the water was the head of one of these animals staring straight at me. And all I could see was a reflection from the navigation light on their eyes, or their red eyes from the nav light, and almost like a red glow on the nose. And they looked reptilian, and they looked about the size of a dog, a big dog's head. That's what it looked like. And I just looked, and it was literally no more than an oar's length away from me, staring straight at me. And I thought, well, I won't tell you exactly what I said, but something along the lines of, you've got to be joking. And then I looked to my left, and another one was up out of the water. And again, I could only see the eyes reflecting the navigation light and the illumination off its nose. And it hit. Now, I'm perfectly aware, sitting in here talking to you in my front room, that it was probably just breathing. But I can promise you at that time, it sounded like a hiss. And I just thought, I need to get off this deck, because these are very, very aggressive predators. All the fish are gone, and they're now looking at me. Unfortunately, because you row where possible naked, I was naked just to add to my vulnerability. And I had to step over the oars, strapped across my boat, and get to the cockpit. And the only saving grace for me is I put some shorts on, inadequate shorts, running shorts, and a particularly inadequate diving knife, and a right-angled torch, and I stayed out on the deck. I had one leg in the cabin, but I didn't retreat to the cabin. For about 35 minutes, shone the light onto these animals, and there were, as I say, 7 or 8 of them popping up around the boat at different times. And every time I hit them with the light, they'd disappear under the water and pop up somewhere just outside of the range of the light. And never once could I get the light on enough to identify them, and never did they come close enough for me to identify them. I ruled out, well, obviously it wasn't turtles. Nowhere, they were way too fast and aggressive for turtles, although they did seem to have that sort of a head, but on a much larger scale. I thought sea lions at one point, and I keep going back to that these days, trying to find a rational explanation. But I remember ruling that out at the time as well, that they weren't sea lions. I'd seen sea lions and seals at sea, but it wasn't like them. And I literally didn't know. They disappeared after about 35, 40 minutes. They eventually lost interest in me and disappeared. I then went into the cabin and locked the cabin door for the rest of the night, which I don't often admit. But I didn't feel like rowing in the dark with those things literally no more than 18 inches away from me if they wanted.
My goodness, I can't imagine what that must have been like for you. And I also know that on that row, you also had some other visitors of the rather large variety in terms of passing ships.
Yeah, I've got to say that came with equal terror, because the equipment in those days wasn't that reliable, lighting you up on the radar of passing ships. In the North Pacific, it's all massive industrial shipping. They're not looking for you. Even if they are looking for you out the window, they're not going to see you in a rowing boat. So if you don't show up on the radar, you've got to avoid being hit by them. And I had 4 occasions. I avoided at least 4 where I literally rode from under the bows of passing ships, and it was bone-chillingly terrifying. I remember the last time it happened, I'd come out a week's worth of fog, which brings its own nightmares, in quite strong winds as well, and I was rowing, so relieved to be under a blue sky again, and then saw a ship coming towards me over my shoulder. and realised, because I'd got so good at avoiding these things, I was actually going to hit it, and I couldn't row fast enough to get past it. It's an enormous 375-metre container ship, immersed container ship. And so I jumped onto the VHF, the short-range radio, said, unknown vessel, whatever position it was, this is ocean rowing boat off your port bow. There's a risk of collision. And I can remember the guy almost falling off his chair, or it sounded like that, as he acknowledged the call, but he did acknowledge it. And then he immediately turned the ship to starboard, or started to turn it to starboard. And I was so close by that stage, it meant the back of the ship was now likely to hit me. It was coming round to hit me in this turn. I jumped back on the radio. I said, stop the turn. You'll miss me if you keep going straight. I'm glad to say he did. He stopped the turn. And then the one bonus about that was I could actually have a conversation and get a message home. So I spoke to the guy on the radio, never forgot his name, Palios Henrik, and asked him if he'd send a message home. He did. And possibly the most memorable part of that whole meeting was the last thing he said to me as the ship was disappearing over the horizon. I never got the chance to see him personally. Last thing he said to me on the VHF radio before he hung up was, Mick, you English, you some crazy bastards. I've been called worse.
So it sounds like the solo voyage had some unexpected highlights and lowlights as you describe it. When you were there with Chris, did you get on well together? Because I can imagine being in a pair in such a small space, there would be the potential for arguments or frustrations. How did that work out?
I think that was our secret. I think we were the best possible pairing. Certainly from my point of view, Chris is the best partner for me. I suspect I was more challenging for him at times. We got on really well. We got on well beforehand, and I knew instinctively Chris would be somebody I could work with. You'd have to go a long way to find a nicer guy or B, a more capable guy. And we both knew that in that pressure cooker environment of 6 months on a boat, that's not an expedition. That becomes your way of life at that length of time, that any unnecessary argument, and basically most arguments, if not all, are unnecessary, would risk destroying the project. And so we had times, both of us, when you knew the other person just didn't want to talk, was just on a bit of a low. And we managed that perfectly. We knew when to each other up and when to leave each other alone. So we had a few bits where we were managing each other, but we had no arguments, no real argument at all on that crossing. And I think that was in many ways the secret of our success, because there's not many people can live together on something the size of a large dining room table, working that hard for 6.5 months and say that they didn't have an argument.
That does indeed sound like a big success for you there. You said at the outset, when you were describing what was in the boat, you talked about music and audio. And I'm wondering if there were any particular tracks that stuck in your mind that either motivated you or just were memorable.
Yeah, absolutely. Throughout music, and to some degree audio books, because music can lose its novelty after a while. You need a different kind of stimulation, but music has been key to all the rows. A, because it's an emotional connection to a positive time in your life, positive memories 9 times out of 10. But the best example I can give of the power of that, again, was on the solo row when I was learning the joys of the North Pacific, where it was just gently pushing me backwards for about 7 or 8 days. Every 2 miles I went forward, it shoved me back 3 or 4 miles. And bearing in mind, I didn't know if it could be done. I thought, is this how it's going to be? And I was going berserk of frustration. It was just so soul-destroying. Probably as low a point as I've been on an ocean rowing boat, and thinking I just wasn't going to be able to make it. And there's a playlist that my brother made up for me of songs I specifically asked, get me stuff that I wouldn't normally listen to so I can discover it on the row. And at what seemed like the lowest possible moment, a song from Divine Comedy, a group I wouldn't probably listen to, and certainly an album track that I wouldn't. At just the right moment, this song called Charmed Life came out of the speakers. And one of the verses in Charmed Life was, if I can remember the quote, it says, sometimes life is like being afloat in a raging sea in a little rowboat with the waves just trying to wash you overboard. But if you take your chances and you ride your luck and never, 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 never give up, those waves will take you to a friendly shore. Unbelievable. It was as if it had been written for me. And it grabbed me at a moment when I was pretty much at my lowest and absolutely transformed it. Taught me one of the biggest lessons I've really gained from ocean rowing. And that's that no matter how bad the situation is, no matter how little control you've got over what's going on around you at that particular time, one thing you've always got control over is your approach to that situation. You're seldom beaten by the challenge in front of you. You're invariably beaten by your approach to that challenge. It comes from you. It doesn't come from the challenge in front of you. And that ridiculous song, that it's my favourite song now. That unlikely event and that completely unexpected song allowed me to find a catalyst for change, to stop that spiral down, that defeatism that was settling into me, and turn it round into, all right, I'll never, never, never give up. And the proof of that was because I was still going backwards more than I was going forwards for the following 8 days. Nothing changed except my approach to that problem. And that allowed me to get through that whole period. So I've never forgot that, which is so important. And you always control your own approach to a problem.
That's such a powerful message to be reminded of, Mick. And I'm imagining that you take that forwards today. I don't imagine you're just sitting on your sofa doing nothing. What's your latest challenge that's keeping you focused?
Well, I have to say, over the last 18 months, I've spent more time on my sofa than I care to. But I'm glad to say that the light at the end of the tunnel seems to be here. For me, next year's quite a big year. It's the 40th anniversary of the Falklands War, which I was fortunate enough to take part in as a very young Royal Marine. And I want to do something to acknowledge that significant, probably last significant anniversary before we're all wheeled out in bath chairs. So I'm literally in the middle of creating the project where I'm going to kayak from the Commando Memorial up in Scotland, and therefore using coastal and mostly inland waterways via Glasgow, Sheffield, Coventry, Bristol, Southampton and Portsmouth, and finally to the Yomper statue. People will remember that statue. It's the Royal Marine with a Union Jack on the antenna of his radio. Basically, he was tail end Charlie for 4-5 Commando as they moved out from San Carlos on the Yomp all the way to Stanley in the Falklands. As much as a fundraiser for the Royal Marines charity, I'm going to use it as a vehicle to get as many interviews as possible from people, not just soldiers, but families that were affected, people who worked as civilians to that whole project, get filmed records of it so I can create an archive for generations to come of the people who actually took part and their experiences and the impact it had on them. I'm glad to say last week I did the first 5 interviews, and if I had any doubts about the value or power of those interviews, they were dispelled as each one was brilliant. It was an eye-opener for me listening to those interviews and meeting those people.
So it sounds like another worthy project that you're going to be involved in, Mick. My final question to you, and I suspect I might know the answer to this, or you might have alluded to it already, is when you are in that bath chair in your older age, what will you hope that your legacy is?
I hope that I can in some way have created something where somebody's gone, well, if he can do that, well, I can do this. It's all about passion. And I've got a passion for the sea. And that's like one of those words that people dismiss really quickly. Oh, passion, it sounds romantic nonsense, but it's not, because all passion is, it means you've got fuel. You've got unlimited fuel and energy to pursue that goal. We all know it. We've all got things that we're drawn towards that we want to do. I love the sea. I was passionate about the sea. So it gave me a reserve of energy to achieve those goals that made it possible. And the secret is to look at somebody's adventure. Hopefully somebody will look at the things I've done and think, well, I'm passionate about that. It doesn't have to be ocean rowing. It probably wouldn't be. But just to show them that it's possible. You can pursue your passion and it can be done.
Well, I'm sure that by what you've shared with our listeners today, Mick, you will have engendered some energy, curiosity and passion within them to take that step into the unknown in whatever way that is. If the listener wants to find out more about you and the projects that you have, the books you've written and so on, how might they be able to do that?
Well, there's a number of ways. My book's available on Amazon, both my books. The first book was Rowing the Pacific, which covers right up to the 2009 successful crossing of the North Pacific. And my latest book came out last year, and that's Never Leaving Man Behind. And that tells the story of work I've done with recovering veterans since then, a series of kayaking adventures, which culminated in a circumnavigation of part of the Falkland Islands with an old friend who was suffering from PTSD from that war. And more recently, I had the honour of rowing across the Pacific with another old friend of mine from the Marines, Steve Sparky, who, when we reached Hawaii from California, we raced from California to Hawaii, and when we reached Hawaii, Sparky became the first blind person to row the Pacific Ocean.
Wow, sounds like amazing adventure stories. I'll put all the links to these things in our show notes so that our listeners can connect with you, Mick, and find out more about all these amazing activities that you've done. It's been absolutely inspiring today to listen to the adventures that you've had, not just once nor twice, but on many occasions, all of those rows. I'm imagining then if somebody just calls you up tomorrow and says, fancy a row across the Atlantic, you'd be the first to put your hand up.
Don't encourage them.
Thank you again for your time, Mick. It's been really inspiring to speak to you today.
Fantastic to speak to you, Sue. Keep up the good work.
Well, I hope Mick's story encouraged you to think about what's possible and to reflect on what you are passionate about. Remember, you can find transcriptions of this and all the other episodes on the Access to Inspiration website at accesstoinspiration.org. We will be taking a break for a few weeks now and be back again soon, bringing you the results of the listener and guest impact survey and, of course, lots more conversations to inspire you. I look forward to connecting with you again soon.